All right, let's take a look at section 2. Here's your focus question. Populism's defeat in the South allowed for the imposition of a new racial order. The Redeemers, a coalition of merchants, planters, and businessmen who ruled the region after 1877 and claimed to have redeemed the South from the corruption and horrors of black rule, worked to reverse Reconstruction's achievements. They reduced taxes and public spending and cut back public schools, which especially hurt blacks. New laws allowed the arrest of those without employment and increased punishment for petty crimes. As the South's prison population rose, convicts, mostly poor blacks, were rented out to railroads, mining, and lumber companies as cheap and voluntary labor at high profit. Labor unions in the South, most notably the Knights of Labor, assailed the convict labor system, which rented out prisoners, a majority black and in jail for petty crimes, to private businessmen. In the 1880s, Atlanta editor Henry Grady relentlessly promoted the dream of a new South in which an industrialization and agricultural diversification would deliver prosperity to the region. While planters, merchants, and industrialists prospered, the region as a whole became more impoverished. While mining and textiles developed in some areas, the region's low wages and taxes and convict labor did not spur much economic development. By 1900, except for the major iron and steel city of Birmingham, Alabama, southern cities had little industry and mostly exported cotton, tobacco, and rice. The South as a whole stayed dependent on the North for capital and manufactured goods. As late as the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt would declare the South the nation's primary economic problem. Black farmers, the most disadvantaged rural Southerners, suffered the most from the region's economic condition. In the Upper South, mines, iron mills, and tobacco factories offered some jobs to black workers, and some black farmers owned land. In the Rice Kingdom of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the plantations went to ruin, and many blacks acquired land and became self-sufficient farmers. In most of the Deep South, however, blacks owned a smaller percentage of land in 1900 than they had in the late 1870s. In southern cities, institutions such as schools, churches, businesses, and clubs created by blacks during Reconstruction formed the basis of dynamic black urban communities. But the labor market was racially divided, and black men were excluded from skilled and professional occupations, while black women were limited to wage work as domestic servants and were excluded from occupations open to white women. Blacks, trapped at the bottom of an economically stagnant South, migrated by the tens of thousands. In 1879 and 1880, nearly 60,000 African Americans moved to Kansas, seeking political rights, safety, education, and economic opportunity. Its participants called the move the Kansas Exodus, named after the biblical account of the Jews' flight from slavery in Egypt. But despite worsening conditions, most blacks had no choice but to stay in the South. While economic expansion took place in northern cities, most employers there offered jobs only to white migrants from rural areas and European immigrants, not blacks. Only in World War I did jobs open up for blacks, helping spur a massive movement northward called the Great Migration. Neither black voting nor black office holding came to an abrupt end in 1877. Blacks continued to cast ballots in large numbers, although Democrats solidified their control of state and local affairs by redrawing district lines and substituting appointive for elective officials in counties with black majorities. A few blacks even served in Congress in the 1880s and 1890s. Nonetheless, political opportunities became more and more restricted. For black men of talent and ambition, other avenues, like business, the law, or the church, increasingly seemed to offer greater opportunities for personal advancement and community service than politics. The banner of political leadership passed to black women activists. Most female activists emerged from the small urban black middle class and preached the necessity of respectable behavior as part and parcel of the struggle for equal rights. They aided poor families, offered lessons in home life and child rearing, and battled gambling and drinking in black communities. Some poor blacks resented middle class efforts to instruct them in proper behavior. But by insisting on the right of black women to be considered as respectable as their white counterparts, the women reformers challenged the racial ideology that consigned all blacks to the status of degraded second-class citizens. Social movements that helped to expand 19th century boundaries of freedom now revised their goals so that they could be achieved in the new economic and intellectual environment. Some black leaders, for example, started to emphasize self-help and individual self-advancement into middle-class America as an alternative to politics. Booker T. Washington symbolized this change in black life. In 1895, Washington delivered a speech, the Atlanta Compromise, at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition, urging blacks to accommodate segregation and cease agitation for civil and political rights. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a center for vocational training, and he believed obtaining farms and skilled work was more important than full citizenship for blacks. He told a white audience in Atlanta, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Whites who wanted a docile labor force that would not form unions and work cheaply embraced his vision, while many blacks supported him from a belief that direct assaults on white power were failures and that blacks should build up their own communities. Between 1890 and 1906, every Southern state enacted laws or constitutional provisions intended to eliminate the black vote. Because the 15th Amendment prohibited the use of race as a qualification for the suffrage, Southern lawmakers designed laws that seemed colorblind but were meant to keep blacks from voting. Most popular were the poll tax, which was a fee citizens must pay to be eligible to vote, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and a requirement that a voter show an understanding of the state constitution. Although some white leaders presented disenfranchisement as a good government measure that would end fraud and violence in elections, it was a means for ending black participation in politics, and it worked. By 1940, only 3% of adult blacks in the South were registered to vote. Poor and illiterate whites were also disenfranchised by these laws. Disenfranchisement led to a generation of Southern demagogue politicians who mobilized white voters by appealing to their racism. And disenfranchisement could not have occurred without Northern approval. In 1891, the Senate defeated a proposal to protect black voting rights in the South, and the Supreme Court approved disenfranchisement laws. According to the 14th Amendment, any state that deprived its male citizens of the franchise was supposed to lose part of its representation in Congress, but this was not held to apply to blacks. Thus, Southern congressmen had far greater power than their small electorates warranted. Alongside disenfranchisement in the 1890s, segregation was imposed throughout the South. Laws and local customs that required separating the races had existed in the North before the Civil War, and during Reconstruction, Southern schools and other institutions had been segregated. In the 1880s, though, race relations in the South were fluid, with some railroads, theaters, and hotels admitting blacks and whites, while others discriminated. In 1883, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had outlawed racial discrimination by hotels and other public facilities, and held that the 14th Amendment banned unequal treatment by state authorities, not private businesses. In the landmark 1896 ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson, the court approved state laws requiring separate facilities for blacks and whites, arguing that segregated facilities did not discriminate as long as they were separate but equal. States responded to Plessy by passing laws requiring segregation in every part of Southern life, in schools, hospitals, restrooms, and cemeteries. Despite the doctrine of separate but equal, facilities for blacks were either inferior or non-existent. Segregation was an important part of a system of white supremacy in the South, in which each part, such as disenfranchisement, economic inequality, and inferior education, reinforced the others. Segregation did not so much keep races apart as ensure that whites would have the advantage wherever they did meet. A racial social etiquette developed in which blacks had to give way to whites on sidewalks and could not raise their voices at whites or otherwise be assertive. Segregation also affected other groups, including Chinese laborers in Mississippi and Mexican Americans in California. Went ahead there. Blacks who challenged white supremacy or refused to accept the indignities of segregation faced political and legal power and immediate violent reprisal. In each year between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 persons, most of them black, were lynched in the South. Lynching continued well into the 20th century. Some were secret, others were public and promoted by organizers in the media. Lynchings often resulted in atrocities against the victims, and law enforcement rarely prevented lynching or punished lynchers. Many victims were accused of having raped or assaulted white women, an allegation often without basis, as proved by Ida B. Wells, the nation's leading anti-lynching crusader. But many white Southerners considered preserving white womanhood a sufficient basis for extrajudicial murder. Lynching is virtually unknown as a phenomenon anywhere else in the world. The reconciliation of the North and South in the 1890s and 1880s came at the cost of widespread hopes for racial equality that had existed during and after the Civil War. In popular literature and at veterans' reunions, the war came to be remembered as a tragic quarrel between brothers, in which blacks had played no role, and which had been caused by clashes over states' rights and the preservation of the Union, not slavery. Reconstruction came to be universally seen as a period of black misrule imposed on the South by the North, a view that legitimized disenfranchisement and segregation in the South. Southern governments and schools celebrated the lost cause of the Confederacy and condemned the evils of Reconstruction. Even as Northern Protestants abandoned the concern for racial justice and turned to sectional reconciliation, Southern churches played a role in keeping the idea of the Old South alive by refusing to reunite with Northern branches. Nationwide, textbooks emphasized images of happy slaves and black troops fighting in the Civil War were all but forgotten. And at times when black veterans sought to participate in memorials, they were met with violence from whites. So that was our second section. We'll be back with the third.